Hi, I'm Joyce Harper, Professor of Reproductive Science at the Institute for Women's Health at University College London. Welcome to Season 3 of my podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? This season, we'll be diving into topics that explore how to achieve good health and happiness. I'll be speaking with leading experts who will provide evidence-based advice and debunk some of the many myths around our health. Additionally, I'll be having conversations with individuals who bring unique perspectives through their lived experiences. In Season 3, we'll cover a diverse range of topics, including reproductive anatomy, inspiring female icons, chronic health conditions, factors that influence our well-being, and global women's health issues. I really hope you enjoy Season 3 of Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? Welcome to another series of my podcasts about female icons. Today, we're talking to Lucy Ward about Catherine the Great. Lucy is a writer and journalist. Growing up near Manchester, she went on to study early and middle English at Oxford University before becoming a journalist, first working on education for The Independent, then becoming a lobby correspondent for The Guardian. She spent over 5 years at Westminster campaigning for greater female representation, securing the first lobby job share, and discovering that you could climb to the illuminated roof of the palace and project your dancing shadow onto Big Ben. After a few years in Russia, she worked as a communications manager at the University of Cambridge, where she developed her interest in communicating complex research for lay audiences. Her first book is The Empress and the English Doctor. Welcome, Lucy.
Hi, Joyce. Thanks very much for inviting me.
It's a real pleasure. And I always start by asking my guests a little bit about their career. So, Lucy, what led you to your first career in journalism and now to become an author?
It's always really difficult to remember precisely what led you into it. I think journalism is so much a kind of identity career or sort of personality job that it's not one that you find out about later or haven't really heard of. You know, you've maybe seen it on films, or in my case, my dad was a journalist, so I was definitely always aware of it and always thought of it as interesting and exciting. And I think in a way I saw it as a kind of way to enable me to go into any situation, find out about anything I wanted with this excuse of being a journalist. So it was kind of a means to an end. It was more than that too, but I think there's this wonderful thing in journalism about you are able to almost absent yourself and to put on this kind of suit of armor, this costume that then opens doors for you, or maybe doesn't open doors for you, but you hope it will, and gives you a reason to go into situations or meet people and ask them things, and to remove yourself from it. I think actually, funnily enough, I think it's changed a bit now. Lots of younger people want to go into journalism because they want to be activists or they want to change things. And I think that's part of what I think most journalists have, a set of values or something that that maybe a way they want to see the world change. But I actually wanted to do it to go and hear what people had to say, and to go and listen. And I like voices, I like accents, I like the way people speak and express themselves. So yeah, it was a combination of different things, but it was this kind of free pass to go and be nosy that I think really helped.
And I think being an author is being a bit nosy as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I think a lot of the skills you need, and maybe the personality traits are the same. It's about a desire to find things out, a desire to ask questions, a desire to kind of forage about in the undergrowth of information. I think one of the things, and this is particularly, I know this is true for me, I imagine it is for a lot of authors, is a desire to go back to original words. Again, I like to do that. If I write a book, I don't want to do it through other people's versions. I always want to try and go back to the original text. And that's partly because, frankly, in writing my first book, I realized that people make mistakes in looking at things, and then those mistakes get handed on. There's this kind of Chinese whisper effect where if someone makes an error early down the line and they're a kind of seen as a respected source and that people use them without doing that checking, and it's not always possible or people don't have time, then you get this, constant series of mistakes. So your job is to do as much back checking, I think, as you can from the original. Plus, I just like the original source. I like it, particularly if you're writing history and you're actually going and touching a piece of paper, say a letter or a birth certificate or whatever, that someone has actually had a connection with, because that's one of the great joys of historical research, is this feeling of physical, from your hand to theirs or their hand to yours is just extraordinary. But you're getting it right. And also, when people take bits of text, say from a letter, they might not find something interesting in the rest of that letter, so they leave it out, and you go and look at it and there's something really remarkable that kind of really shouts out to you, and you may, you could discover things that are really important, but you're seeing more in it. Or you might even just see something about the way it's, if you're in an archive and actually looking at something, then you're looking at the way it's folded, at the handwriting, the address, the thing that makes it somebody else's. And I love all that. But yeah, the connection with journalism is this feeling of other lives again, isn't it? Of wanting to know, and I think in my case particularly to see how people express themselves. I'm really interested in that. We'll come to this later, but one of the difficult or fascinating but tricky things about the book that I'm researching at the moment is that it's about a man from an indigenous community where there is no written archive. But I am finding all sorts of things around it. So it's about working out how you can respect his history while using the sources that you have and kind of trying to fill in that space.
I loved what you said. A couple of things you said there were very similar to science as well, not just history. So going back to the original is absolutely paramount. So my last book, I wanted to go back to the original, because what happens is that, as you said, people misinterpret things and they get passed through several textbooks or whatever, and then we end up with this notion. And when you go back to the original, even in science, you find out that actually it was a misinterpretation. And also what you said about a letter, that two people can read it and pick up different things. So it's the same with the scientific paper. Two people can read it and even come to quite different conclusions about what the authors are saying. So that's quite interesting. Very, very similar for me, actually, in my role as well.
I think there is something, there is an element of a sort of scientific diligence about, historical research, and your job is to go through, piece things together. It is in some ways a scientific approach, and this first principles issue of can we kind of almost replicate these same findings. If I read this letter, do I feel the same thing? Answer no. I mean, that's the point of, otherwise we'd only ever write one biography of anything. We go back and we see if we had a different reaction or brought together different material all about that same person. So there is that. And I mean, my book that we'll talk about was about science and history of science, and I find it phenomenally interesting, and there are definitely these parallels. But of course, when you write a book, you build this structure of facts, as you hope they are, as well as you can, and then around that you create this kind of casing of imaginative response. Your job is to not just go this happened, this happened, this happened, the end, but to think, what would that have been like, if somebody is making their way, say, as in my book, to St Petersburg in a coach in whatever season and going along the shore of the Baltic. What would that have been like? How scared would someone have been in the presence of a female leader who was such an incredibly important global figure? That's your job, is to meet these facts emotionally sort of halfway and clothe them in something that can mean that you connect other people to them and can convey them with interest, and don't just give a kind of a dull lesson with a pointer, a kind of PowerPoint. You're really trying to bring them to life in the cliche. But I think that conversely in science, and again I thought about this a lot when I was writing a book about 18th century scientists, but it totally applies now, is you're working with data, you're working with ever more kind of complex systems, but unless you bring that creativity and imaginative contribution to it, to interpret those and to sometimes come from very much left field and really think about what they might mean, again, you're not really doing your job, are you? I mean, that's where you might as well be AI. This is where surely humans have something to add. I hope. And so I think that, I mean, this is a very old debate, isn't it? Science and the arts. There's absolutely room for both kind of types of approach and types of mind in both spheres, I think. And it's really interesting. It's most interesting when they collide.
Yeah, that's great. Now, let's go back to when you were a journalist. So, when you started, how was it being a female journalist, and have things changed over the years?
Um, I think so. I took my first proper job in journalism in 1992, which was on a local paper, a regional paper in Bradford in Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, a paper called the Telegraph and Argus, and I was part of their trainee scheme. Very traditional way of learning journalism. We were sent away for 6 months to Hastings, to a journalism school. So poor Hastings was full of clueless journalists wandering about with soggy notebooks in the rain, kind of asking people things pointlessly, and trying to learn shorthand and looking increasingly stressed by having to get 100 words a minute, which we did get, or we weren't allowed to go back to our jobs. And I still think that's an incredibly good training, and it forces you to learn how to go out and talk to people, stop them in the street, explain who you are, kind of ask them some ridiculous question like, what do you think of Kiss a Traffic Warden Week? And just kind of carry it off, And again, this is where this kind of shield of journalism just allows you to do mad stuff, which not necessarily everyone would want to do, but I did. And so that, and actually now, apparently, it's incredibly difficult to get young journalists even to ring people up. They're so used to, remotely contacting people via email or messaging or whatever, and I think young people, because they haven't had much chance, it's just what you're used to, they don't ring, and so for them it's a really big deal, whereas my goodness, you rang people all the time. That was, I mean, they might put the phone down on you, but you were definitely trying. Plus we even had to doorstep people, as it's called, you had to turn up at their house. I'm afraid we even did something that I think some people think of as very nasty, which we called, in the kind of awful shorthand of journalism, death knocks, which is where if there'd been a death that the paper regarded as, for whatever reason, newsworthy, you would go to the home of somebody and ask if you could talk to them about that person. And I did that quite a lot on my local paper, and I would actually defend it, because it meant that I would go and talk to people in a very, very, not in a confrontational way. You would turn up and you would say, if this happened to me several occasions where a young person had died, and you'd ask if you could talk to them about that person so that you could write about them as a sort of tribute to them for the paper. And it's incredible. I don't know if it would be the same now, but at that time in the 90s, people almost expected a journalist to come. And often the poorer the neighbourhood, the more willing they were to talk to you, and they would invite you in. And I had some of the most incredible conversations I've ever had in journalism with parents who had lost a child. One I remember where their child had died of a drug overdose, and they wanted to talk about drugs and young people. Another one, the son had died diving in a quarry, and just totally awful accident, but they wanted to talk about him and give him, just pay a tribute to him. And I did the best I could to kind of do justice to how they felt. And it was, in both cases, I was crying with them, and my notebook was again soggy, and but I feel as if I did something that they wanted, and I know that they were pleased with. So it's a strange job. What kind of job involves things like that? But you know, all you can do is try and be really honourable and fair. And I did try to do that. In terms of women, there were women. There were women reporters. Not very many women at senior level. There are still too few, I think. At my local paper, it was Yorkshire in the 90s. There was a fair amount of sexism. I mean, I'm pretty tough, and I was, would just sort of be vaguely rude back or ignore it or whatever. But it toughens you up if you need it. When I came to London, I did some shifts on the Daily Mail, and I worked at the Times Education Supplement, all very civilised, the Independent. And then I came to work at the lobby, which is the parliamentary lobby. So I became a political journalist for The Guardian. And when I worked there, that was just after the 97 election, when Tony Blair's Labour Party had won a landslide. So there'd been a big shift in the constituency, if you like, of of Westminster, lots of new MPs, including a lot of women, especially because Labour had all women shortlist. There were a lot of Labour women MPs. I think there were 101, and I think there were about 120 women MPs altogether. This was record breaking. And so newspaper editors were in a bit of a panic that they had all these kind of older men covering politics, and yet here are all these women, and how are these men to talk to these new women? Hadn't we better employ some women political journalists? This is newspaper arithmetic. We need women because otherwise we won't be able to talk to these random new women. So they employed some of us. I turned up there when I was 27, I think, and there was quite a sort of cohort of us around that age that kind of turned up. And we were reporting on ludicrous things like, oh, there are lots of new women in Parliament, let's install tights machines and more women's toilets. And, so we were reporting on this kind of phenomenon of all these women being there, which kind of manifests itself in all kinds of ludicrous ways. And also in, I think, very interesting ways. I got very interested in this okay, you've got these women. Should we expect them all to behave like women and talk about things that affect women and female constituents and women's issues more generally, whatever they may be? Is that fair? Or what if they just want to go off and talk about defence and not go anywhere near anything to do with how expensive and rubbish childcare is in Britain, say? And some of them would be really understandably quite resentful about the expectation that they should focus on these quotes women's issues, whereas others, there were some that had been there all the time and had been arguing for women's representation and more consideration of issues that affected women as constituents, as voters, like say Harriet Harman, and these people's ideas were absolutely bang on. And now we see how right they were to look at things like childcare, to look at domestic violence, to look at women's representation, to look at things like maternity rights, be it care for women, be it the fact that at the time I think maternity leave was about 12 weeks. They looked at the sort of right to take to have family-friendly employment rights and so on. They put these things on the agenda that I think people think are much newer, but my goodness, they were campaigning for those in the face of absolute sexism all those decades ago. And I didn't have kids then, but I thought I've always been a very fierce feminist, and I found those things really important. And the lobby itself as a place to work as a journalist, as I say, women were not in senior positions. In fact, we were always the kind of third, fourth, fifth on a political team. We were usually sent to cover the Liberal Democrats or anything that was deemed to be marginal. I did a lot of covering the Lib Dems. That's fine. It was interesting. It's always interesting to do the things that not everybody is stamping over. But, the fact that it was almost expected. Their press conferences were always full of women. We did some things that were quite we tried to be a bit punchy. I can remember going to Labour press conferences during, I think it was the 2001 election, and us kind of making the point that women were not being picked to ask questions, that often women weren't being put up to speak by the party. And just actually ridiculous. I remember raising this once and Gordon Brown was doing that day's press conference, and we decided that it would be only women that would ask questions from the media pack that day. And the men sort of always used to get a bit frightened at these things. It would only be allowed for one day. And we began asking why. And I think he had a woman next to him, a Labour MP. It doesn't matter who it was. And we said, why there never women women aren't saying much on your election panels. And Gordon Brown kind of interrupted to mansplain why, in fact, it was absolutely fair and that women did do this, completely proving the point. So I think, I tried to write about these issues. I tried to write about women at work, about women's representation, the way women were seen in Parliament, the way that they were, treated, described as Blair's babes, that kind of thing. This kind of, it's a difficult one because I am interested in what they had to say around issues that had long been neglected that did affect women. But I would also absolutely argue for their right to specialise in whatever they wanted to, just as people. But the way there was definitely sexism in the way they were written about. There was sexism for us in the way as women we were treated as journalists, although there were also plenty of men that treated everybody very well. I'm not saying it was a daily battle, but just as an example, I can remember that there are sort of networks in politics, obviously, and that's how you find out what you need to know. And when Labour got in, a lot of the young men remarkably young men, really, that advised Blair and his government were footballers, and they played on a football team called Demon Eyes, which was named after a Tory attack line about Labour. And this demonised football team included, Labour advisors, and it also included some journalists. And, it meant that they would go to play football, go to the pub after, and all discuss what was going on in Downing Street, in Parliament. And this was a direct source of information for men of my age who were doing comparable jobs in national newspapers in the lobby. And no women were involved in that. Well, I think maybe one woman from Downing Street allegedly played in this team. But, it was just that without even thinking about it, they were creating these networks. So I and another few women decided we would have a women's lunch club in the lobby, and we would just invite guests and have just women journalists. And we did that. And I can remember this sort of feeling among the other male journalists of this kind of intimidation where they would see us talking in corridors and say things like, was it a mother's meeting? And, like, they couldn't kind of cope that when you push back a bit, you could see that their default expectations were very much that things should be as they had always been. One other thing, final thing. I remember when I had my first baby while I was working in the lobby, first of three children. And in fact, I was pregnant with my second, then I didn't go back after that. But after the first one, I was determined to go back. But I can remember older men, very lovely colleagues in the lobby saying, "Oh, so you'll be leaving, when you have this baby," and me going, "No, I'm going to come back." And the expectation was, almost like when married women had to give their jobs up in the sort of 50s, 60s, it was that you wouldn't come back. And I did, and not only that, I negotiated with my paper, The Guardian, to have the first job share in the lobby, certainly newspaper job share with another woman, which meant that I was able to come back. I think those things are tough now. I think it would be because now there's 24-hour news, and now there's social media, and it's relentless. And also women, above all, as journalists, will be abused online and so on. The whole job is so much harder than it was then. But still, I'm glad to have done that.
Yeah, it does seem that you were in the right place at the right time, coming in when they needed women, female journalists. And for me, going back to work full time when I'd had my kids, I used to turn up to conferences with babies in tow, and used to get a lot of snidey comments. Oh, I saw someone with a pram, thought it would be you. I work in women's health, so yeah, it's still hard today for sure. Now, Lucy, you made a career change, so you were a journalist for many years. Has had this great career. And I've spoken to a lot of women who have had a career change later in life. So, how have you found this now, changing your career to being an author?
Um, this isn't being sort of female false modesty. I wouldn't say I had a great career. I was very lucky, and I worked hard, and I know, lucky. Sorry, I I did well, and it's great that I ended up on a national newspaper, and I really enjoyed it. But I was part time because I was working 3 days a week for a lot of that because I had kids. I kept it going all the way through having the three of them and after. But in the end, I did stop working, and that was heartbreaking. Really, I remember taking redundancy from the Guardian and crying as I signed the letter where the solicitor said to me, "You really don't want to do this, do you?" And I said, "No, I don't." So and in fact, we'll come on to things you would advise people to do, but I don't know. I don't know whether that was the right thing. I mean, it's done, and I don't really go over things, but it certainly was a loss because, as I think I was indicating before, journalism is it is a vocation. You can't really leave it. It's a way of thinking and a way of being. And so to not be able to express that or write it like that is difficult. However, I left it, and then I've done other. I have continued to do some bits of journalism and also work in communications here in Cambridge, which has been really interesting and actually has been very has developed my mind and my thinking in lots of ways. I wouldn't knock it. But once you're a journalist, I don't think anything's ever quite the same. But then, yeah, I got interested in a particular story, which I saw almost as I would have seen a news story as a journalist, but it was a historical story, and I was particularly fixated on it. And even it took me about 7 years to actually write the book that I then wrote, because I was bringing up kids, and then I had 2 years living abroad, and it was a far slower burn. It's obviously a very different career on one level, and to be fair, it's not a career in the sense that it can support me, certainly at the moment, but a different way of writing. It's obviously far longer. Usually I would write something that could be something between 500 and maybe 1,500 words. So to write 103,000 was daunting. And I just had to think of it. I mean, it sounds really dumb, but that with journalism, I think a lot of journalists have quite short attention spans. And, it's kind of write something and then it's done and then you're on to the next thing. That's the whole nature of it. So to kind of have to and want to obsess about something and live with it for sort of a number of years is very different. But as I was saying earlier, I think in terms of the skills that you bring to it, and that curiosity and that desire to research and really find out about a time and a place and pick up the colour about it, as you would call it in journalism, I think that's actually remarkably similar. It's just that if you want that dopamine hit of kind of regular journalistic deadlines and publication, then of course you're not getting that. It's a massively slower life and different, and pacing it is hard, I think. But equally, you never get that chance in journalism to spend that much time focusing on one thing and really getting your head into it. So it's an absolute privilege. It's an extraordinary thing to be able to do. And I have to do it by weaving in and out of other jobs and trying to keep it going. But right now I'm writing, and it's great. Well, not writing, researching, putting off writing, obviously, till the last minute. I'm very deadline driven, fear driven.
Let's pick up your book now. So your first book is called The Empress and the English Doctor, and it's about Catherine the Great, and we'll come on to the physician that she the story is about as well. So you said that it grabbed you. What grabbed you about her story that made you want to spend many years writing about her?
Well, I had learnt about. I didn't study history at university. I studied early and middle English, but so the relevance of that is my interest, I think, in texts and translation almost, and really looking closely at text. But anyway, I had done history A level, which included British and European history in the 18th century. And I was taught about Catherine the Great by an excellent history teacher, as so many people have. It's a teacher that inspires you. And I can remember her telling us about Catherine, and I remember very distinctly her talking about the myths about Catherine, including the, didn't she have sex with a horse myth that I still have to deal with very often. Answer, no, sorry. But talking about her, but we obviously studied her life and her rule and the ways in which she led, and that's both domestically and as in terms of foreign policy and war. And she really is unmatched. Certainly in that century, there's no woman, and possibly barely not any leader, so powerful and just sort of remarkably ambitious, and that had such an impact. I suppose possibly Peter the Great, but she was a woman, and with all of the additional obstacles that implied. And so I had this interest in her, combined with this frustration almost on her behalf that she had had to face such kind of sexism and such sexist taunts and so on. I felt very more than indignant, angry that what's the one thing that people might know about Catherine the Great? It's a lie about her sex life. And this woman, which it doesn't mean that I think she was, politically, I don't know, admirable, that she wasn't cruel in she was an autocrat, but she was an extraordinary leader, and we are judging her by completely the wrong, wildly according, to the wrong indicators. So that was my interest in her. I then moved to Russia with my then partner's job with my family. Got very interested in Russia. The children had gone to Russian school. I tried to learn Russian, and So I was fascinated by that. I came back to the small town in Essex where I live, and my kids all went back to English schools, having been in Russian schools. And in the playground of my son's school, I met someone that first day back, and I said, "Oh, he's coming into school at a bit of a funny year. It's because we've been abroad in Russia." And she said, "Well, my family has a Russian connection." And I thought, well, that will be, that she's Russian, or it'll be relatives or something. And she said, "My great 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 grandfather inoculated Catherine the Great against smallpox." And I just thought, wow. So I kind of pinned her down in the playground, just ignored the children, and I got her to tell me this story. And it turned out that her ancestor had been a doctor, a man called Thomas Dimsdale, and he came from Hertford. He was born in Essex, but was working as a doctor in a place called Bengio, just outside Hertford. And he'd become an inoculator. Smallpox inoculation was a technology that came to Britain from Turkey. It's an amazing story of how it got here. And it kind of developed through the 18th century in a way that it hadn't in other European countries. The British adopted it, and they overcame a kind of public resistance to it. And Thomas Dimsdale was a combination of he was a Quaker. He was very concerned about his local community and being a doctor to the poor, really. But he was also very much a high society inoculator with very, very prestigious patients, and an incredible track record, very sort of famous for various reasons and prominent. And he'd published about the method of doing inoculation safely. And inoculation, by the way, is the precursor to vaccination. So this is before Jenner realized that you could use cowpox to inoculate people with against smallpox, and it would still work. Cowpox is a cousin virus of smallpox, but it still gives you immunity. This was when inoculation involved giving people a dab of actual smallpox live virus, and then they would get smallpox, but in a way that the body could manage and could produce immunity, and they'd get over it and then would be immune for life. It's actually even more effective than using cowpox, where you sometimes had to re-vaccinate. Anyway, so this doctor had ended up going all the way to St Petersburg to inoculate the Empress of Russia and her son, and then come back. And then it turned out he'd gone again and inoculated her grandsons. And this is a bit of a spoiler alert. She does survive the inoculation. And I just thought, how have we got this connection between this Hertfordshire village and the most powerful women on the planet over in St Petersburg? And how had this arisen? And I just literally went home that night and Googled it and tried to find out about him. And sure enough, there was the story. And it was kind of buried in some of the biographies. There are a number of excellent biographies of Catherine the Great, obviously. Some of them focus a lot on her kind of overseas policy. Some of them do much more, do maybe her art and cultural life. Others do, her love life. But even no matter what, some of them might refer to it, but they didn't really explore this event. And I just thought, God, this is so remarkable that she did this. And it's so, it says so much about her that she chose to take this risk. And as I researched more, I found that it was less of a risk than I think people still think now, that it's remarkable how established and how successful this technology was. But nevertheless, she did something that was dangerous, chose to do it, weighed up the science, weighed up the data, if you like, and then risked her life, and she did, and her sons, because she really believed in science, and also because so not just to protect herself and her son, but to influence her people by saying, I've taken this risk and you should do the same, because mortality, particularly child mortality in Russia at that time, we're talking about the sort of latter part of the 18th century, 1760s, child mortality really, really high. I mean, smallpox was absolutely devastating. It was called the speckled monster in the 18th century, and it killed about 1 in 5 people who got it, and almost everybody got it. It's not a disease of poverty. Everybody was potentially at risk. And she could see that was one of the things that was wiping out great chunks of her population. As now, Russian population wasn't as high as she wanted it to be, and it was a problem. There weren't enough people, and that was at the time very much seen as that was the wealth of the country. So you're losing people left, right, and centre, especially children. But there's also enormous superstition against inoculation in Russia, and she wanted to change that. So she was going to set a personal example as well. So she's doing it for herself and her son, protect her heir, also influence people within the country. And then, very importantly, she's doing it to demonstrate, well, two levels more. One, to show herself as an enlightened leader, because Catherine's mission was to turn Russia westwards, to make it a European state. She explicitly said that. I mean, this is, you can see this is a debate or a kind of issue that we still see playing out in Russia. You know, which way does it face? Is it east? Is it west? Is it its own kind of place to itself? And she wanted to follow on from Peter the Great and turn Russia to the west. And so that meant adopting Western ideas, Western enlightened thought and practices. And inoculation was absolutely perfectly symbolic of that, because what inoculation does is take away that medieval and post-medieval idea that disease is an act of God, because it means that you can forestall it. So it's not just about God punishing people. Man can, or people can, get in the way of that, and they can use science to protect themselves. And that frees you from the idea of, you know, that disease is vengeance or it's connected with behavior or whatever. So I see that as this one of the ultimate Enlightenment ideas, and that's not just me. The French philosophers of the Enlightenment who produced a extraordinary dictionary of the environment called the Encyclopedia of the Environment of the Enlightenment. One of the biggest sections of that is on inoculation, and they were fixated on it, huge supporters of it, because to them it represented the triumph of reason over sort of emotion, unfettered emotion. It was what you would, if you were thoughtful and reasonable, this is the action you would take. So by supporting inoculation, she was also representing herself as a enlightened ruler on the throne, which she really wanted. She wanted to be seen as that. She boasted about it to Enlightenment figures like Voltaire. We can talk about that later. And so she's representing herself and also as somebody who will protect her people, as this kind of little mother of the Russian nation. So she's shoring up her personal power. She's defining herself as an enlightened leader, and she's also defining her country as a Western-facing enlightened state. So she's hitting a number of really crucial things with this one tiny scalpel lancet going into the skin. And I think that was a lot of what I found so fascinating, that this is a woman using her body for a political act. It's absolutely an act of statecraft. But, you know, what do women use their bodies for? You know, what do we hear about women in power? It's to have an heir. Possibly you go off and fight. But to use it as a scientific experiment, that's something truly remarkable. And I can't think of any, I never found anything to match that. And that was what really fascinated me. And of course, that irony of her body being known for something that wasn't true, this, you know, alleged sex with horses. And yet this true thing that she had done, this very brave and interesting thing that she did, being not known at all. And you know what? Now it is, because I've gone on about it and people really do seem to know. So I'm thrilled. But yeah, I felt I could just, there was a kind of, you know, a balance to that story. There was a kind of need to set this record straight, I thought, and to remove really a slur that had been directed against her ever since the 18th century. You know, the minute she became more and more powerful as a ruler, how are you going to destroy a woman leader? How are you going to destroy a reputation? Oh yeah, let's just say she's, you know, she's a let's use sex, basically. This woman is all those horrible words that we can think of that we use about women. And, you know, it's so cheap, it's so easy, and it was ridiculous. I mean, yes, she had some lovers, not that many. And you know, she's hardly alone in that. But you know, I found cartoons at the time, political satirical cartoons, you know, where there's one particular one called the Imperial Stride, and it's interesting. It was produced a bit later in her reign, well after the inoculation. By the time she's had 2 wars with Turkey, and of course has invaded land that now is what Putin wants to get back from Russia. This is we're talking about where she takes land owned by the Ottoman Empire, so into Crimea, what's now Crimea and now Ukraine. And there's a satirical cartoon of her with one foot in St Petersburg, I think it might be Moscow, and the other one stepping onto Constantinople. So and it's called the Imperial Stride. And then underneath her voluminous skirts, there are tiny figures of the leaders of different nations. So Frederick the Great of Prussia, George III in England and Britain, and so on, Louis the 16th. And they're all looking up her skirts and making kind of lewd comments that are kind of, just puns on her anatomy, to kind of really to attack the fact that she's so successful, I guess, in terms of just, her foreign policy. So she's powerful. She's too powerful. So to take her down, they have to attack her sexuality, attack her as a woman. And so I just wanted to rebalance some of that and show what she'd actually done with her body to set an example for her country. And I think I was also really fascinated by the fact that she seemed so modern, that she understood the power of influence and the power of personal example. And one of the things she did when she had this inoculation, which was secret, it's a really remarkable story. It forms the kind of core of the center of the book. She goes through this procedure, and then once she's recovered and she knows she's going to be okay, and her son has recovered, she goes. She has all this happens in an amazing palace called Tsarskoye Selo, just outside St Petersburg, and then she goes back to St Petersburg with her son, where her son has been inoculated, and she has bells rung and fireworks go off, and there's like a massive party across Russia. She kind of gets everybody to celebrate, and then she commissions a ballet and a play called The Defeat of Prejudice, which is all about, her as Minerva, sort of defeating all these clueless people that are kind of against the latest science. And she uses every bit of possible ammunition she's got to promote this action that she's taken. She knows how to influence. She even declares a public holiday for her inoculation, which, if you want to really make people in favor of something, give them a day off, give them a public holiday. She knew how people's minds worked, and she associated inoculation with celebration and with, partying, really, and that's very clever. And she also had some medals minted that said, in Russian, she led by example. She set an example, and so that's what she was trying to do. She was trying to use herself for people to copy. And of course, when you're talking about a medical procedure that people see as dangerous, you don't want to be just telling them to do it. And she understood that too. She told the doctor, Thomas Dimsdale, that I wrote about, and I think that I was the only person to see this, it was in a footnote to one of his treatises, that she understood that as an autocrat, she could just, force everyone to be inoculated. But there was this enormous superstition in Russia. And so her political understanding showed her it was much better to just to lead by example. And what did we see in COVID? We saw precisely that, politicians having themselves filmed having the COVID vaccination, because, and we did have those debates slightly about enforcement and compulsion. And I think anyone sensible knows, well, there are different views on it, but if actually what you want to achieve is to get people to do this, then compelling them and getting the state to tell them what to do with their body is very rarely going to be the answer. And she understood that and discussed that with the doctor, and I found that fascinating.
I remember you started writing the book before COVID happened, and you're in the middle of it, and you thought, well, is this going to be a good thing or a bad thing? But I think it worked out in your favour in the end, and your book does highlight a moment where science, politics, and personal risks collide, as we then had during COVID. So I think it was really good timing. So, were there any other parallels you found with modern vaccine debates and public health leadership?
I think this question, I think it was just really extraordinary to see, particularly in France. It's interesting, actually, in Britain in the 18th century, after some kind of, there was debate and there was resistance, definitely, to inoculation, not least as it was practiced by women. And in Turkey, oh my gosh, it's women and it's from the East, and it's not us. But then, as people recognize that it worked, I think, there is a pragmatism in British attitudes that meant that particularly once it became more affordable and other kind of barriers were taken out of the way, that it really did take hold here. Whereas in other countries there was a lot more resistance, and in somewhere like France there was top-down governmental. It was actually banned in France for a while. The state didn't want it to happen until Louis XV died of smallpox, whereupon Louis XVI was inoculated, had everybody in court inoculated, and there was a huge shift. It's amazing what someone dying of it can do. But the French, while in Britain there was this adoption and refinement of the technique and so on, in France there was philosophizing, as I was saying, and so they really, really explored these questions of what would a rational person do, and if you're a parent, is it you've got your love of your child, and the fact that obviously inoculation requires you to deliberately expose them to some risk, but with the hope of the core issue of vaccination, isn't it? You take a small risk in hope that that will protect you from a much larger one that hasn't happened yet, and that's a tough one when you're a parent. I think even now, when you have your babies and you have to take them for the MMR or whatever, people are concerned, and of course we know they are, and we know the MMR has dropped off, so that there's direct parallels with attitudes now. But in France, they explored this, and I found that really interesting. But I probably hadn't expected there to be. Well, when I pitched the book, I pitched it before COVID, and I raised the issue of vaccine skepticism and said that I thought that was where there were commonalities and it would be interesting. I never expected there 2 months later to be a pandemic. So it did become highly sort of specifically relevant. So I think, the fact that there had been resistance to inoculation as far back as when it first came to Britain in the 1720s, that there were literally, the word anti-inoculators was used in 1722, and I found that pretty extraordinary. And then I thought, and these parallels around political, how public health works, how do you best persuade people to do what you think is the right thing health-wise with their bodies, when of course we've gone back almost to that level of superstition, and people are kind of hearing all kinds of crazy, I'm sorry, I do think they're crazy, absolutely misleading and appalling, false information around these issues. How do you deal with that? So there were more parallels than I'd expected emerged during COVID. I think female leadership, and whether there was some indication sometimes that women leaders, we talked a bit during COVID, it feels a long time ago now, but about the way women leaders had led, and was that more effective in some ways than what some of the men were doing. So obviously I picked up on that as well. There were many ways of reading across, and I think that's fundamentally because it's about human nature, and it doesn't change. We're not very good at analysing risk. We love our children and we want to know how to protect them, but we don't quite know how. We're trying to work out the best thing to believe. None of those things change. I found, kind of unnerving echoes, really. I was in some ways very, very lucky to be researching it at that time, because I think it made me, explore things and think of things that I wouldn't have done if it had just been, a normal couple of years.
Yeah, it was good timing. You seem to be lucky with your timing, Lucy, for sure. So besides the story of the inoculation, Catherine definitely was a female icon. So what would be the other part? Well, it's hard to summarise, I'm sure, but are there some other facets of her life that you'd like to share that really made her stand out as a woman of power and influence?
Well, I think the thing with Catherine, she had a pretty long reign, and she's the longest reigning Russian leader, not the longest leader overall, because that's Stalin. But I think Putin's trying to overtake her, and could do shortly. I think that there's so many remarkable aspects to her reign. One of which is how she actually became leader, where of course she potentially, we don't know, but her husband died in slightly mysterious circumstances. He was on the throne, this is Peter, and to whom she'd been betrothed at 14. He was difficult, complicated, quite sort of sad individual in a way, who'd had this rather brutal childhood and never quite seemed to grow into a man. And I don't think she had much time for him really from the first. She kind of managed him, and they really sort of grew apart. but yeah, he becomes leader in emperor in 1762, and he was on the throne barely 6 months, and then was killed by his guards, and no one knows if she actually ordered that, and it feels as if possibly she wouldn't have done, but nevertheless it was very much in her favour. So you have a coup and Catherine takes over. So she's usurped her husband, he's died, they claim it's an attack of hemorrhoids that's killed him, which is obviously ludicrous. So she has to move very, very fast to establish herself as a leader, because she's a woman on the throne. She's a foreigner because Catherine wasn't Russian, she was German. She came from she was born in a place called Stettin, which is in Prussian Pomerania. Very managed marriage, kind of organized by her very ambitious mother. So she's this foreigner, albeit that she's learnt Russian, become Orthodox, changed her name, very much integrated into Russian life, court life, absolutely. But still, suddenly you're vulnerable when it looks as if you've bumped off your husband, and she so she has to establish very quickly that she's going to be a good leader, a strong leader. Russians want a strong leader. This is a huge country, lots of borders, and so she moved very, very quickly. She was very interested in social reform. She'd spent the years waiting to become leader, or for her husband to become leader, reading political philosophy. She was very interested in that. She wrote a paper on that, something called the Grand Instruction, that was on kind of how they could reform the laws. Wasn't something she ever fully implemented, but still a sort of impressive piece of work. Started with the phrase Russia as a European state. She very quickly introduced sort of social reforms around education. She wanted to improve education for the great, huge amount of illiteracy in Russia. So she did some experimental work there. She was interested in sort of new forms of schooling. And in terms of health, obviously what she was doing with smallpox inoculation wasn't just about herself. She then built hospitals. She tried to implement a program of inoculation across her empire, and she was still bashing away at that, several decades after she'd had her own inoculation. She knew that this was something she had to keep going. She was interested in this question of child mortality, again, through a kind of mix, she would say herself, of humanitarian interests and trying to get the population up. And she built maternity hospitals in Moscow and St Petersburg, and she did things like arrange ways for babies whose mothers couldn't keep them, to drop them off safely where they could be left sort of anonymously and then looked after. And so they were kind of foundling homes, if you like. And she created a lying in hospital for new mothers. She did understand this need. She had this combination of humanitarian instincts, especially very early in her reign, and then a kind of economically minded view that you must protect your population because that is your wealth as a country, or part of your wealth. So I think that's interesting about her. And then she also probably early on had more liberal ideas around serfs and liberation of serfs than she was ever going to implement. I mean, people always get more conservative. Leaders always get more conservative as their reigns go on. She wasn't any different. She got more and more involved in foreign policy and, frankly, into annexing more and more land. It's interesting, after her inoculation, the first thing that she did, once she'd recovered and she'd had all this kind of promotional activity, was declare war on, it wasn't Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. So she goes into the First Russo-Turkish War, which Russia wins, and then eventually there's a second one, and that's where they take that land that is Crimea, present day parts of present day Ukraine, which were then given back, and that's why Putin now kind of idolizes her. And she was a very ambitious and kind of relentless leader in terms of foreign policy. Russia swallowed up part of Poland, divided it up, and Poland just vanished in that latter part of the 18th century. She really was that kind of old school empire builder, and quite remarkable in doing that. Whatever you think of it, as a female leader, she had absolutely her eye on eating up that map of Europe. and was incredibly successful in doing it. But I find it very interesting, that sense that I wrote this in the book before Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine, the invasion, but that feeling that she saw something, she saw a relationship between the strength of her body and the that her readiness to go to war. Like there was something about her physical fitness and Russia's strength, and I think we see that with Putin, that he kind of allies his own physical strength, with Russia's, hence the taking off of his top and standing wrestling bears or whatever, catching fish. She almost is doing that, and she wrote to people saying after her inoculation, saying, the talk is of inoculation and of war. She felt strengthened and fitted for this conflict. Obviously, she wasn't fighting herself. She said, "My troops go off as to a wedding." She sent them off to go and fight. And so I find that relationship very interesting. The sense of a leader's personal physical strength, and their feeling that their country is also, ready to go and fight.
That is a really unbelievable list of achievements and changes that she made. She was obviously such a strong female, and as you said, not even Russian, etc. So she had so much against her, and she really, really had such a big influence. Do you feel there's other female? Well, there are others. What other female monarchs from any country would you say have been such influential queens through history and have shaped politics, culture, social progress as Catherine the Great did?
I think it's such a big question, and I'm sort of hesitant in a way to kind of pronounce really broadly. I think one of the things that I found interesting researching that book was the women that we don't really necessarily hear much about from the 18th century, who did have these reforming instincts and were very educated and, if you want to use the word, enlightened, but did have influence. I think Maria Theresa of Austria was very interesting to me. Again, what do people necessarily know about her? Just in common knowledge, not necessarily that much, but she was another sort of get it done woman leader. She also introduced educational reforms. She also introduced inoculation in her country, so quite health reforms were very important. Education, particularly agricultural as well, and reforms to kind of law, administration, government, kind of set up the Austrian state, if you like, in the way that that would fit it for the future. She's interesting. I found that Caroline, this is, it's not a kind of question of enormous national influence, but even somebody like Caroline of Ansbach, who was the Princess of Wales, she was the wife of George II in Britain. She was very well educated. She would, again, interested in music and culture and so on. But again, she had she was influenced by a very interesting British aristocratic woman called Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who brought knowledge of smallpox inoculation from Turkey, where she'd been because in Constantinople, her husband was British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And she saw inoculation in action, and she had her son inoculated there in Turkey, and then brought the idea back and had her daughter inoculated by British doctors here in Britain. And she persuaded Caroline of Ansbach, who Princess of Wales, to do the same with her daughters. And because obviously, if you have the monarch setting an example like that, that's very influential. At the time, inoculation wasn't going to spread beyond kind of elite circles for various reasons, but it mattered. She took this step, and she didn't have to. She thought about it, and I found that interesting. So I think sometimes you have to dig more. We could all talk about Elizabeth I or whatever, but I was interested in these details of these women that were wanting to reform or open to these surprisingly modern and scientific ideas. And inoculation was a really interesting sort of test of that there were these women, and George III was also very interested in inoculation. There were the Habsburg monarchs were, sorry, not the Habsburg monarchs, the Georgian monarchs were the Hanoverian monarchs were all kind of very open to this science and this particular idea, and I found that that really fascinating.
Thank you for that. Yeah, really, really interesting. So, Lucy, I know you're writing another book, and you said you can tell us something about it. So, can you give us some insights into what it's about?
Yeah, it's a book with a handhold from the first one. The first book is called The Empress and the English Doctor. And when Thomas Dimsdale, the doctor, came back from St Petersburg, having safely inoculated Catherine, he became a real celebrity. She'd made him a baron of the Russian Empire. She'd given him vast amounts of money. She'd given him loads of merch, like diamond encrusted snuff boxes and things. So he comes back very famous, of course, and has this enormous sort of profile. And then so he came back in 1769, having done the inoculation in 1768. And then in that exact period, Captain Cook was on his first voyage of going to Tahiti, where he was tracking the transit of Venus across the sun. And then he was sailing around in the Pacific on a sort of another mission. Now, after that, he went out a second time. Well, he made 3 voyages in all. On his second voyage, he brought back a young Polynesian man called Mai, or it might be pronounced May, and the British called him Oh My. It's all very confusing. And Mai spent 2 years in Britain as a kind of enormous celebrity in between 1774 and 76. He was welcomed by the king when he arrived. He visited Westminster, Cambridge, the Royal Society. He toured the aristocratic homes of England. So the book is about him. But he arrived, he came to court and was presented to George III immediately on arriving on ship, and he was sent to Thomas Dimsdale to be inoculated by the king. And so he'd appeared in my first book as being a kind of just as a story of how well known and famous Thomas Dimsdale was, that the king would send this visitor straight to him. And so I got very interested in him, and he kind of threatened to take over the book a bit, and I had to stop him because it had to be a book about other really interesting people. And then I never lost that interest. And my first book came out in 2022. And as it came out, I saw that an extraordinary portrait of Mai by Joshua Reynolds, the English portraitist, was for sale. And the government had put an export bar on it because it thought it was a national treasure and shouldn't leave the country. And so an export bar creates a window where an organization or an individual can come forward and buy a piece of some kind of cultural artifact and keep it in the country. And I was seeing that nobody seemed to be campaigning to save this painting, and it just seemed extraordinary to me that this painting, which is the first painting, is a grand portrait, full-size portrait of a non-white individual, of an indigenous Polynesian man, but of any non-white individual, by one of our greatest portraitists, Reynolds, was going to potentially leave Britain. And I thought, we know that we have galleries in this country that are full of pictures of white men, and we really should. This is an incredible portrait as a work of art, but also as a piece of history, and as a means of reflecting back to Britain today that all sorts of people have come here and been part of this society, and we should celebrate that. So I did a bit of poking around, and I think the price tag on this painting was £50 million, and it was so difficult for any institution to say that it would raise that. So I did my best, and I kind of wrote a letter to the Financial Times and got lots of people who were much, much more influential and celebrated and educated than me to sign it, and pushed that campaign and as much as I could. And then after that, the National Portrait Gallery said it would campaign to raise the money. And it did. And then I kept bashing away at it and writing articles and going on the Today programme and talking about it. And obviously the Portrait Gallery was doing all that it could, and it made an arrangement with the Getty Museum in America, because I don't know that there would have been any way of raising 50 million here. And it came up with this very interesting new arrangement whereby the portrait would be acquired jointly by the Portrait Gallery and the Getty. And that was what happened. And that was announced in April 2023. And the painting, Portrait of Mai, is right at the heart of the National Portrait Gallery. It is the most important acquisition they have ever made. And they almost didn't make it, but they did in the end. And it's in the kind of crowning glory when it reopened. That's wonderful. And it's actually literally now just gone on tour. It's going to Bradford, back to where I started as a journalist, for the City of Culture, and then it will be coming here to Cambridge, to Fitzwilliam, and then to the Box Gallery in Plymouth, which is wonderful. And then next year it will be going to the Getty itself for a few years to coincide with the Olympics there. And just for, obviously, they own half of it, and then it will come back to the National Portrait Gallery. So yeah, it's very exciting that people can go and see and see this man, and my book is about him. It's about how he came to come to Britain, about Cook's journeys, and how this man came, why he was so celebrated, what hopefully he may have thought of Britain, certainly what a lot of people thought of him. But what I'm trying to do is, as much as I can, try and understand from his point of view what it was like to come here, and what it meant to him, and then what it meant to go home again, which he did. He went back with Captain Cook on Cook's third expedition and was dropped off back in on a neighbouring island to Tahiti. He was dropped off with a remarkable collection of extraordinary items that the British thought would be useful to him. So kind of porcelain, crockery, and a suit of armour, an electrical machine, a jack in a box. I mean, just slightly surreal. And lots of animals and things. And very sadly, he died quite shortly after being left by Cook on that island. But there's something about him coming here and Britain getting to grips with what it meant to be exploring in that part of the world, eventually going on to kind of plant the flag in Australia and New Zealand. At the time that Britain was losing the American colonies. It's an interesting, very fluid time. But in the middle of it, there's this man's life. And so the book is about him and the time that he came here.
That's so fascinating, the way you've weaved all of that together, and from your first book and then the portrait. I love your timing, Lucy. We're back to that again. Your timing of everything is just.
And I think this timing is a bit later than it would have been nice to have had a book contract for this a bit earlier and got on with it a bit earlier. But things are for a reason. It'll work out. So I just need to write fast, Joyce.
You do.
Very fast.
I know that's hard. I've written nothing this week. We're coming towards the end now. Now, Lucy, I've called my podcast "Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This?" And I think for the historical work that you've been doing, I think that's still really important. So, have you heard people say, "Why, maybe, but why didn't I know of Catherine the Great or whatever?" What have people said to you? Why didn't I know this before?
Yeah, they really have, and I think particularly this thing of it's not just why did no one tell me this, it's why did they tell me all this other stuff that's not even true.
Yeah.
To which I say, check your history and ask yourself why people especially make up stuff about women. They make up stuff about lots of people, especially if those people have power. But a woman with power, people are going to try and take her down. And so I think we should all bring our critical thinking skills to everything, to contemporary politics. It's no different. But always look, a woman that's smeared, and has to deal with sexual slurs, there's always a reason. And it's always because she's just that bit too powerful for some man. So I would say always ask those questions. But yeah, I think there's, to be fair, brilliant historians have written about Catherine. There's a lot to go at. There's so much to say about her, and I think there's absolutely room for both. I think it can be really extraordinary to really bring your magnifying glass to one moment in one scene almost. I mean, almost to this one pinprick, in someone's life. And then expand out of it. I think that's a really interesting way of telling a story. But there are obviously, it's also right to do these big overview biographies, or to just talk about one of her relationships with Potemkin or whoever it happens to be. There are so many ways to write a life, and there's room for all of them, I think. So I'm not in any way, I wouldn't criticize anything. I relied heavily on wonderful biographies of her, but I did really enjoy having this particular lens on her.
Yes, absolutely fascinating. Now, to totally change the subject, my last few questions. I think you know this. I'm quite obsessed with happiness and happy places and people living their best life. So I've asked all my guests, Lucy, what makes you happy, and where is your happy place?
I really love. Well, if I'm honest, I'm not going to go on about it again, but I do really love researching. I love rabbit holes and going down just lurching from one mad idea to another. And I think it's an enormous privilege to be able to do the research I'm doing, and I love that. And also to go to places that relate to the people that I'm writing about, or touch the things that they, have had connections with. All of that is great. But you kind of know that. So I love walking, and I did the coast to coast walk with a friend, not all in one go, because that's quite difficult to fit into life when you're with kids and so on. But I did it in 3 sections with her, and we we were ill prepared. Both of us walk. It wasn't as if we were not fit enough, but we went on the first leg, which starts in the Lake District, in late September, early October, a couple of years ago, and it was really shocking weather. And if I tell you that I had a kind of bag for life as my rucksack liner, and she had waterproof trousers that eventually were so useless that they just kind of fell off her and flowed into a reservoir. I'm sorry about that. We were not brilliantly prepared for the first leg, and it involved some quite scary climbing over a hill, the highest part of the walk, called Kidsty Pike. But the next 2 legs are in the Yorkshire Dales National Park, and then the North Yorkshire National Park and Moors National Park, and they were beautiful. We had great weather. It was idyllic, and that moment of arriving at the end of that walk into Robin Hood's Bay in absolute sunlight, sparkling sea, was just a complete joy. And to have done that with a friend, a lovely friend, and to have walked and talked for all those miles, and to have crossed our country, so it felt as if there was a purpose. I like there to be a journey, a distinct journey, and we'd done it. I thought it was wonderful, and I would recommend that kind of multi-day walking, and a journey that other people have done before. It's a bit of pilgrimage to it. You can make of it whatever it means to you. And to be out, I'm from the north, I'm from Manchester. I like Essex. I love North Essex. I like Cambridge, but I miss hills. And so to go and do that walk for me was absolutely wonderful.
And we did a bit of a coastal walk once, didn't we? We had it felt like a
We
couple of
did.
hours where we didn't meet anybody, and we thought, has the end
No,
of the world happened? Or so
yes, that's
it was like,
right.
we haven't met one dog
I
walker
know.
or anybody. Do you
Yeah.
remember?
I know. I think we were under a bit of cliff where there wasn't really a way down. So you either had to have committed for one end or the other, and clearly no one had. But yeah, no, that was another good one. Yeah, walking along the coast, also great. Love a bit of the Cleveland Way. Yeah, I
I
need to do
did.
another walk.
We do. I did worry that we were never going to get up anywhere, that we were going to get cut off by the time. But it was exciting. It's
Yeah,
exciting for sure. And
yeah, I'm going up. Yeah,
sorry.
no, I was just going to say I'm going up to Scarborough and Whitby for some research for my book, because Mai went up there. In fact, he
Ah.
swam in the sea at Scarborough. He was a sea swimmer, Joyce. It's an amazing episode in the book. It's really extraordinary. So yeah, I get to go, and I actually get to go to Tahiti, I hope, as part of my research. And then I also get to go to Scarborough and Whitby. So both wonderful, honestly. I'm excited about both.
Well, Lucy, I think you have to swim though. If you go, you have to reproduce what he did.
I will. I know. Well, he swam. He swam for 3/4 of an hour in the bay out from Scarborough, and I don't think I've got it in me. I'd be terrified. But he was from he's from Polynesia, and for him, it was absolute second nature to be in the water, and that's what is so interesting in that part of the story. You'll have to read about it, but it's all about the fact that he was totally at home in that element, and none of the English people he was with were.
People think I'm mad. They must have thought he was really mad.
Yeah, I think they found it absolutely extraordinary. Yeah, yeah.
So, Lucy, that's brilliant. Now, the very final question, and you did mention this earlier. What advice would you give your younger self?
I thought about this, and I think that, oh God, I think this is probably the classic woman advice to younger women, which is, have that confidence to, don't let anything hold you back, just believe in yourself and so on. But I think be slightly more specific in that I think I was good and reasonably good at taking advantage of opportunities that arise, and probably putting myself in the way of some of them and kind of grabbing them. But what I don't think I did enough is to really sit and think, well, what do I want? How do I, rather than just seizing moments, of kind of going, what sort of person am I? What do I want to do? How should I live? How should I develop my career and myself? And what can I do to make that happen? It shouldn't be just seizing things that other people might give you or that might pass by you. It should be, how do you actively set out on your course and consciously do that? I think maybe people do that more now anyway. I think there's more reflection in so many ways. And I think I was pretty unreflective. I'm not sure I even am that reflective now. And maybe that made me, if not exactly happier, then less susceptible to unhappiness, because I just kind of charged along. But I think I wish I'd sort of gone, you know what, I really want to go here or do this, and I will resolve to do it, rather than just grabbing and making the most of things that were there anyway. More agency, more active decisions.
That's brilliant. That's really, really good. Lucy, it's been absolutely fascinating. You've brought up so many different issues that can affect women anyway, women, any woman, but certainly women of power, and Catherine the Great. That's really been totally fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's been really a joy. It's always lovely to talk to you, but it's been great fun, and I hope people now know the truth about Catherine, or part of it at least.
I'm not going to say anything about horses.
No, don't you dare.
Thanks so much, Lucy.
Thank you. Bye.